Thanks for having me. I think before we get started, I'll share a story. I'm going to go back 15 years ago. 15 years ago, I was doing something completely different. I was actually in Quantico, Virginia, training to be an FBI analyst focused on counterterrorism matters. And so for many years, I was working on counterterrorism issues, specifically focused on counterterrorism financing, or terrorism financing. And in that job, I think it's sometimes, easy to think about the feeling of that you're doing something meaningful, that you're helping out, that there's a specific cause there. I eventually shifted over to working in law and working on clean energy. But the reason I mention that is because I want us to all think about that the industry and working in clean energy and thinking about the clean energy industry. I want us to think about the reason there and some of the motivation there, and to not just think about the job or whatever you do in it as just a job, but thinking about the reason behind it and helping create overall what's more sustainable, helping build out these projects, push us to the future. And so as we go into and dig into these topics about financing the projects, I want us to always think about the meaning behind some of the work that's there, that it's valuable work, and to always think about that as we progress in this. And so with that, I want to start getting into the topic here, which is today we're going to talk about financing clean energy projects. And for background, my name is Samos. I work at a law firm in Sidley Austin, working on project finance and project development. And today the specific topic is going to be on financing projects. And we're going to get into three topics here. The first one is going to be the general topic of financing structures. I think we have a range of experience here, ranging from people who are new to the industry, who may not be familiar with some of these, and maybe some people who have some experience in it. So I want to make sure we lay out the background for it and understand what are some of the basics, what are some of the structures involved, what do you take into consideration whenever you're looking to finance a project. Then we'll get into these key considerations. What are some of the issues? So if you are financing a project, what are some of the challenges in it? What do you take into account from a practical perspective? If you're working with the legal team, if you're working with your business team, what should you consider as you're trying to plan out the financing for it? And then the last part is going to be some of the fun topics of the day, right? What are some of the current challenges? And as you can imagine, some of those are going to be around tariffs, change in tax law, and so we'll touch on that towards the end, and hopefully we can get to that. So let's kick things off with the financing structures. So before we get into the actual financing of it, I want to make sure that we all understand, right, the complexity of building a project. When you think about a project, you want to think about all the different components that go into it. And the reason for this is this will all be important when it gets into the financing aspect. When you think about somebody who's giving you money to help build the project, what are they taking into account? They want to make sure that you have a viable project, and the project is going to be made up of a lot of different parts that the lenders will take into account. You're thinking about site control, that means the real property. Can you actually build the project on the site? Can you operate it on the site? What does the construction contract look like? What are the costs that are involved in that? Interconnection, making sure that you can actually have the rights to connect to the grid. Tax incentives, not applicable in all the cases, but sometimes counties might have some tax incentives, so looking at those contracts. The permitting process, what does the supply look like? Will that lead to delays in building the project? How will you actually operate the facility? And then one of the most important parts is how do you make money off of the facility? So that's the offtake. All of these will become important, and I wanted to make sure just lay them out from the very beginning because this will flow into the considerations as we get into more of the financing specifics. All right, so let's get into what are some of the different types of financing here. Obviously, there's debt financing and equity financing, and I wanted to highlight two types of debt financing. This isn't kind of the full scope here, but there's your typical project financing, which we'll go into here, but this is effectively financing that's at the level of the company that owns the project. So let's take, for example, here that I want to build a solar project, and I'm building real solar, right? And so I have different options of how I'm going to finance this. So we'll get into it, what it means to do project financing if I want to fund it at the level of the project company. Back leverage will mean financing it at a higher level, so equity owner, you might get some financing up at a higher level and be able to fund some of the contributions that you make down to that company. And then we'll get into a couple of topics around equity financing. So sponsor equity, and I'm using that term broadly here, but that's just the owners putting in funds into this. It could be a joint venture, it could be just a single owner. And then tax equity, which is a key piece to the renewables projects. Investors who invest into the projects in order to get some tax benefits, tax credits, tax incentives. All right, so let's start with the debt financing. So project finance. So what makes that different than just any typical financing? If you have a big company, you might have operations that you can look at and you might be able to do a more typical corporate financing. But sometimes with these, right, you want to set this up, you have a new business, you have a new company, and the lenders don't have all of that background that they would look at with a typical larger company where they might be looking at all the financial statements. They say, yeah, we're going to lend your corporate parent. That would be more corporate debt. When we talk about project financing, we set this up in a special way, which is we have a special purpose vehicle. What that means is you set up a company that is supposed to be bankruptcy remote. And what that means is that if a lender comes after the company because you failed to pay, they can go after that specific company without reaching back to the owners above that. So without going after the corporate parents up at the top. And if a lender is going to lend for that, that means there's going to be some specific aspects to it. They're going to be relying on the cash flows of that company. So that's going to become a very important piece. They're going to make sure that they have a lien so they can take control if something goes wrong on the assets of the company. And on the equity of the company, so the ownership interest in it. Now, above that, we'll get into back leverage debt, which this is more debt up at a higher level. So sometimes you'll have the debt down at the project company, but you might need additional funds, or you might be thinking about funding some expansions to the project. And so sometimes there'll be debt that's up at a higher level. And I'll show some charts here that way. I think it'll be a little bit easier to see once we get into the charts. So let's look at a project financing structure here to kick things off, right? So let's say I want to build this real solar project. You have a company down here, a project company, right? That's what we're calling it. And the lender will come in, will lend money directly to that new company that you've built. This company will tell the lenders, hey, if something goes wrong, you can take over the assets of the company, you can take control. But sometimes the lenders say, well, we're not in the business of necessarily operating the business, of operating a project, so we want your parent, so some sort of equity owner, to pledges their ownership in the project company. That way the lender can step in and just take the ownership interest in the company itself. Right, this avoids having to worry about, like, okay, am I buying these specific assets? What do I do with these assets? Instead, they can say, no, we're going to take over the ownership of it, and then we can transfer that to somebody who we think can actually control the business. And so here, you have the lender down at this level. They might be providing different types of financing. One of it is you enter into this contract to sell your power, so that's the off-taker. You might have to post some credit support as part of that. And so with that, they might provide special financing, like a letter of credit that goes towards that off-taker. So that's the basic kind of, okay, you've got financing down here. But then you start moving up. Okay, so now as we start moving up the chain here, you might have an owner that owns this company, but then you have investors up at the top. And this gets into some of the equity components we're talking about. A tax equity investor may come in, and then you have your sponsor, so your current owner. Tax equity investor is looking specifically at an ownership interest that can give them some of the benefits to the tax credits. So there might be an investment tax credit, a production tax credit, and then you have your equity owner, who's the one who's funding, sort of, that might be my, like if I'm starting this business, that's my company there that would be looking to actually fund this project, but you want to get this extra investor who comes in to help with this. So that's the initial one, right? But then we think about, well, what back leverage into it, right? So now you have a lender who might come in at a higher level. So this is, you're the investor up here. You want to be able to provide some additional funds. And so to do that, you enter into a loan up at a higher level. That way you can send some of the funds that you receive from the lender, send that money down and help provide funding to that project. This is just kind of the basic kind of you can get into complicated structures here where you have some people who have debt down at the project company. You have other people who have debt up at the top. You might have a combination. You might do a portfolio where you have multiple project companies. And then when you get into those situations, you have to think about all the considerations there if you're a lender. Okay, well, you have multiple projects you're financing. Can you sell one? Can you keep, do you have to keep all of them? So that's the basic structure, right? Now we'll get into more specifics here, right? Let's talk about the equity piece for a little bit, right? So there's different components. There's the ownership, who can fund some of the funds there. Sometimes they will go out and look at joint ventures, for example. And so one of the things that we've helped clients with is arrange some of the joint venture arrangements where somebody else is willing to provide some funding to fund a project. And then you have the tax equity investor, which we've touched on a little bit, but this is getting into somebody who's in it to finance the project, but in return, they're getting some of the tax credit. Now, we won't get into this topic today because I think that can warrant its own kind of standalone discussion on what is tax equity, what are some of the benefits to that, some of the issues. There's now tax credit sales. So there's a whole separate field where people invest and focused on the tax credits themselves. And so that was just kind of the high level, this is the financing piece. So now we'll get into some of the practical considerations here when we're thinking about the financing. You own this project, and you want to take into account, well, what do I need to think about, right? So imagine you're building a project. You're building this solar project, you go to a lender, and the lender is coming to you, and they want to know more about your business. They want to know more about how you set up this project. Three things to keep in mind here. The first one is going to be, you want to make sure that the contracts that you have in place are, you'll hear the term like it's a financeable project. And so what that means is that you have contracts in place that the lenders can be comfortable with. And so this can come into play with, you want to make sure you're getting sufficient revenue. So you've entered into an offtake agreement, so like power purchase agreement, where you're selling energy and you're getting back enough funds to be able to actually pay back the loan. There may be concerns over the construction process, right? Your construction contracts, are they trying to pass through all these costs to you? Is it going to result in these uncapped construction costs, and now the lender has to worry about that there isn't going to be sufficient funding to get paid back? And then we'll get into a little bit on what it means to collateral. What's actually making the lender feel comfortable here? How do they know that if something goes wrong, they can actually recover some of their funds? And the other part is the restrictions, right? And the restrictions, one of the key things about project financing that makes it different from some of the other financings is just it can be more restrictive. There's more requirements as far as how you enter into contracts, what type of approvals, what kind of budget approvals you need to have. You want some contracts, some of the financing will have these requirements where you have to meet certain debt targets, that you're paying off a certain amount of debt, or you have enough cash flow to be able to pay off a certain amount of debt. And then you have to worry about just the other parties that are involved. Sometimes you have other lenders, right? We were talking about the project level debt, we were talking about the back leverage debt. If you have a whole project and you have people who are funding it at different levels, you want to make sure that the two work with each other, that there aren't these restrictions in place that create some issues, and you have lenders who are worried about what rights they have. So let's start with financeable project contracts. So the first one is thinking about, you're negotiating these contracts, you're negotiating an offtake agreement. We'll start with that. The offtake agreement being where you get the money, you're selling your power, you might be selling your renewable energy credits, you're selling your capacity, and in return, somebody's paying you for that. And if you're the lender, one of the big considerations is, how do I know that party is going to keep paying you? And so one of the most important parts is the creditworthiness of that offtake counterparty, making sure that when you enter into an agreement that you're entering into somebody reputable, right? Which that may be tough to gauge, and so there's ways to help support that, which means creditworthiness might mean that that project is guaranteed, the person who's paying for that power, it's owned by some larger corporation that can actually support if something goes wrong, that they can guarantee those rights, or if that's not the case, that they post some sort of collateral, whether it's a cash deposit, letter of credit, that there's something that they post for you. That way, the lender knows that the off-taker will pay, or there will be something that you can go after, or some parent that you can go after that will actually allow that payment to happen. The other concern with the off-take agreements is termination. If somebody, imagine you enter into a contract and say, we're going to buy your power, but if I give you 30 days notice, I can cancel the contract. I know that the lenders are going to think about that. Right? They're not going to like that, right? They want to make sure that you have contracts that are locked in. So one of the important aspects here is making sure that agreements, especially one for the revenue aspect of it, that there aren't these easy outs for an off-taker who's buying the power to just get out of this contract, because if that contract falls away, then the revenue source falls away, and the lender isn't getting repaid. And so, in the end, I mean, like, the lender wants to get repaid. They don't necessarily want to go through, even if they have all the rights to be able to go after the assets, take over the project, take over the equity. A lot of the times, that's not what they necessarily want to do, because it ends up racking up more legal fees. It can be a drawn-out process. It can just create a lot of headaches. And so, when you're working closely with the lender, sometimes it's just, you want to make sure that you're both in sync. They want your project to work out, right? You want your project to work out. And so it's making sure you have these contracts that actually work together properly. The other part of this is the construction process. So if you're getting into construction financing, somebody's funding you to actually build the project, you get into concerns around, well, okay, what does the contract say about who covers what costs? What's going to get passed through? And the reason for that is, if you're a lender and you're thinking about, is this project going to be on schedule? Are they going to be able to pay the construction project? That's important, because when you have a contractor who's building a project and you don't pay them, you could get into some issues around, they might have some priority over some of the money. They have, it's known as mechanics, and lenders don't necessarily like having to deal with that aspect of it. So you want to make sure the construction costs are kept in control. Also, lenders are looking at how to verify that the project was actually built properly. And so oftentimes there are these concepts of these independent reports. There will be consultants, there will be independent engineers who go out, and the lenders will want to be able to rely on these different types of reports to make sure that this facility was actually built properly. And then the other part of this is what we'll call collateral documents, and that's lenders want to make sure that they can step into the agreement if something goes wrong. And so they'll oftentimes negotiate these agreements directly with your counterparties and have certain rights to be able to step in to those contracts to make sure that they can still perform under those, so that way your project doesn't just fall away because these contracts fall away. All right, so now getting into restrictions, and I don't want to go too much into this, but this is really thinking about when you talk about project financing, that there's it can be more restrictive than certain other types of debt. And so somebody's giving you money to actually operate a project, they want to make sure that you're actually on target to be able to satisfy your obligations, that you're able to pay back. And so with that, they will have control over what's in your contracts. Approval rights, if you want to enter into an additional contract, say you want to terminate your offtake agreement and you think, hey, I have a bet for the best, right? I think they will want some approval rights over those agreements that you enter into. They will want to look at budgets. They want to make sure that they have some approval rights, that you're actually going through the budgeting process, that they have some say in that process. And then separate this just means that you're treating that entity separate, especially for the project financing, that it is not, that if they are able to take over that company, that they can step in and that company effectively can run itself without being treated as part of the larger organization. And then, we won't get into this, but there's all these financial tests that can be as part of these financing agreements that lenders look at, especially the project financing, that talks about you have enough cash flow available to cover the debt. And the other part of this is going to be just how you interact with other parties that are involved here. So when you have a debt financing, oftentimes you will have these other parties that are involved. Some of them might be dealing with like interest rates, swaps, so these are what they'll call hedge providers. And these parties sometimes have an interest, like a security interest, on your project assets as well. And so you want to enter into arrangements that make it clear what those rights are between the two projects. And so that's where there will be different types of agreements that handle that aspect of it. So that's just taking into account considerations. Now we'll get into what are some of the current challenges here. And this gets into more of the current issues of what's happening here. Some of one of the topics that comes up a lot now is change in law. And what that means is there's so many changes that are going on as far as new tariffs that are being introduced. What if the tax law changes? What if the IRA falls away and the tax credit rate changes? This has become, a pretty big focal point over the last few months. And so oftentimes whenever you're thinking about financing, you want to think about who's bearing those risks? Who is the one who's going to take a change in tax law? This plays in a couple of different places, right? So this might be in a construction contract, this might be in your offtake contract, and it's making sure that you allocate the risk properly. So sometimes you'll see in an agreement where the offtaker is the one buying the power, and you, or the seller who owns the project, will be thinking about, okay, if there is a change in law, who is going to cover that? And you'll see different combinations of it. Sometimes the parties will try to shift it all entirely onto one. If you're a lender, you don't necessarily want that shifted onto the owner of the project company, because that creates the possibility of greater expenses. You might have to take on more. Ideally, you'd want the off-taker to cover some of that, to be able to pay some more and be able to cover those costs. And so what ultimately ends up happening is you end up in these situations where you agree that you'll cover a certain portion of it, the other party may cover a certain portion of it, and so we can get into these interesting types of negotiations with the contract counterparty to where you try to figure out how to split the risk properly there. But that's a key topic here. And tariffs, right? Obviously there's sort of concern over the changes in the tariffs and how that happens. And so this is another area that lenders have been particularly focused on, which is what do your contracts say about tariffs? What happens if there are new tariffs that are imposed? If that happens, who's going to bear that risk? Is it going to be the project company? Are they suddenly having to pay a lot more? Is it the counterparty? Is this going to make construction, if you're building, is that going to make it more expensive? Is it going to lead to delays? Is that going to mean that now you're going to be more restricted on your how much you can actually pay? And so lenders are particularly concerned around some of the tariff aspects of this. And so this is where kind of a big topic has been, how do we allocate the tariff costs among the parties here? And so it's important to take that into consideration as you think about, whenever you think about financing projects and thinking about what are those costs, who shares in the risk. So it's the same idea, just different aspects, right? Who shares in the risk of if there's a change in law? Who shares in the risk if there's a new tariff? And the other challenge has been just construction delays. So supply issues. I know a couple of years ago, that was a big topic where it was really the supply aspect of it. And there were delays in supply, and that leads to the construction not being built on time. That can lead to the offtake not, you might have dates to where you enter into a contract. Somebody's going to buy the power, but they say you have to build this project by a certain date. If you run into these construction delays, I mean, you've seen projects that have failed because they just couldn't get, they had delay after delay after delay, and then ultimately it led to the actual offtake contract being terminated. And once you don't have the offtake contract, you don't have the revenue contract, now you run into issues with the lender because they no longer see kind of a viable path forward with it. So, yeah, this was meant to be just a very high level topic of this, but wanted to introduce you all again to what are some of the financing structures that are involved when you think about financing clean energy projects. What are some of those considerations to take into account around the contracts and other aspects of it? And then lastly, some of the current challenges that are out there. And so, again, taking it back to the beginning, when you think about this, it's, you know, sometimes the topics aren't as fun, right? You may not think like negotiating around tariffs is going to be fun, negotiating around tax law is fun, but always take it into consideration the reason that you're doing it and how you want to make a difference. You want to push forward. You're helping out an industry, pushes forward to the future. And so it's more about just kind of the small details around the contracts and the issues there and getting the financing. It's also about why you do it and the meaning behind the work that you do. So thanks everybody, and if you have any questions.
We have time for a couple of questions. Do you want to call on them first?
Yeah.
On an offtake agreement, if you're a big enough grill, like let's say Amazon, you're obviously doing that in an SPE, right? Do they have more flexibility in the sense of their letter of credit sunsets after a certain amount of time, or they don't even have to provide it because they're Amazon? Like, how does that kind of work?
Yeah, and so, this is talking about if you have an off-taker, so somebody who buys the power, who's a big enough company, so take Amazon for example, somebody, what kind of support would they provide? Do they have to provide a letter of credit or some cash credit support? And sometimes it's no, right? So what you'll see sometimes is there might be a test that's involved. So it might be like a net worth test, or there might be something that judges their credit worthiness. We'll look at like the financial statements of who that entity is. And so if they're doing it at a level to where you feel like the counterparty is credit worthy, then sometimes you won't see that extra. But then the consideration is, what if in the future they're no longer credit worthy, right? And so oftentimes we'll build into the contracts these triggers where we'll say, okay, this is fine, you don't have to provide any of this additional support, but if in the future you fall below a certain level, you're no longer as credit worthy, now we're going to ask you to post a guarantee from, you know, the parent company, right? If it's a subsidiary of Amazon, we'll want it from somebody higher up, or they'll have to post an actual like, cash or letter of credit.
Cool, thanks.
So my question is, we know that there is a big threat, the IRA be modified, right? In my opinion, I don't think it's gonna go away, fade away, because the structure of the government, there are a lot of people there who rely on the tax credits, right? But in your opinion, what are the main strategies that the companies are doing right now to mitigate those regulatory risks and avoid future projects losing these tax credits?
Yeah, so the question has to do with, there's changes in tax law, including the IRA, and so the tax credit regime could change or go away. And so what we'll see is in contracts, so one is in the offtake contract. So that's one area where there's been negotiations where we've seen certain project companies may ask the off-taker, hey, we want you to increase the price if change in tax law happens to where the tax credits aren't what we thought they were going to be. Now that can be a tough discussion to have with the off-taker because sometimes they might be running an RFP process and they will now say, well, you bid into this process at a certain price, and so it can be a little complicated there. But there are some people are taking the approach of trying to build in these potential price modifiers. But yeah, there will be the so in some cases price modifiers. Other times there will be some sort of termination right. Like in the end, if the IRA fell away to where it made it to be so economically unviable, the project company might want a way out, and so they might negotiate sometimes a termination right. And then it gets tricky into, do you have any liability? Do you owe a termination payment or not? And the off-taker will say, yes, we want you to, okay, you walk away, but we want you to owe, and sometimes they'll say, no, okay, you're good to go.
This will be the last question.
So going on that thing, on that same subject, have you seen where they have opted for a bigger escalator as opposed to trying to do what you just described, assigning things? And so if there's a change in law, the escalator goes from CPI to 10%, and that's what you're going to have for the future part of the contract.
Yeah, so we've seen some constructs like that to where you have you might have different levels. So one is there might be a band where it says, okay, let's say there's a change in tax rate and the tax credit percentage is now going to be within this range. There will be a price increase up to this level. If it goes into a higher range, it'll go to this next price level. And then if it goes beyond that, there might be a termination rate, and they say, okay, now we're out of the contract. So I've seen some like that to where they agree. It will be very dependent on the off-taker. Some people are very focused on like fixed price, and they will tell you just let's set the price up front now, take into account the risk. But obviously the environment that we're in may be hard to really gauge that, and so that's one of the current parts of the negotiation is thinking through how to, like, if you can't fully price that in yet, thinking about what do you need, like, do you need a price increase to negotiate with them if something happens, and then tying that back to the financing, right, because that's in the off-take piece, but the lenders are looking at that too, because that's some of the feedback that we've gotten with clients is the lender will look at it and say, hey, we're worried that this project company is now going to fully take on these additional costs. We want the off-taker to take some of that. So they'll ask the project company to see if they can push for some of those like price increases.
All right, I think that's going to be all the time we have for questions right now. Although I'm happy to volunteer this time. I think I'm good afterwards. But thank you, Mario, for this. I thought it was just perfect. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Let's give Mario a hand.